The room was quiet save for the faint hum of machines and the shallow breaths of a woman in her final hours. A nurse adjusted the sheets, her hands trembling as she glanced toward the door. Then came the sound no one wanted to hear, the slow creak of hinges. Oscar, the hospice cat, slipped silently into the room. His paws made no sound on the linoleum floor, but his presence was enough to make every nurse freeze in place. This was no ordinary visit. Staff had learned long ago. When Oscar entered a room, something unexplainable always followed. The patient's family rushed forward, confused and frightened. "Why is the cat here?" "What does it mean?" one whispered, clutching the woman's hand. A doctor hurried in, clipboard tucked beneath his arm, his expression calm, until his eyes landed on the cat. Oscar had leapt gracefully onto the bed and curled up against the woman's frail body. The doctor's face drained of color, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. What was this aloof cat sensing? And why did it leave even the most experienced physician pale with fear? What could Oscar know? That medicine could not? Oscar hadn't always been the center of whispered fears and pale faces. In fact, when he first arrived at Steerhouse Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Rhode Island, no one thought much of him at all. The year was 2005, and the facility had just welcomed several cats from a local shelter. The idea was simple. Animals were supposed to bring comfort. Other nursing homes had therapy dogs who wagged their tails, climbed onto laps, and made patients smile through their pain. Why not try cats too? That was the hope, anyway. But Oscar wasn't like the others. While the new cats roamed hallways, purring and rubbing against residents' legs, Oscar kept to himself. He hissed if anyone tried to pick him up. He would dart under furniture when approached. His green eyes followed people cautiously, as if measuring whether to trust them or not. Nurses began to wonder if he'd been the wrong choice for the program. "He doesn't even like people," one whispered. "Why is he here?" It wasn't that Oscar was mean. He just didn't act like a therapy animal. He preferred the quiet of closets, the shadows under beds, or the high perch of a bookshelf where no one could reach him. For months, staff wrote him off as a failed experiment. "Some cats just aren't social," they shrugged. But then, little by little, something strange began to emerge. Though Oscar usually avoided residents, there were rare occasions when he would suddenly grow insistent about entering a patient's room. He would sit outside the door, tail twitching, meowing softly but persistently, until a nurse let him in. Inside, he would leap onto the bed of a particular resident and settle there, not on the chair, not by the window, always right against the patient's body. And once he was there, he refused to leave. Nurses found it odd, but at first they dismissed it. Cats had quirks. They picked favorites. Maybe Oscar was finally warming up to people. Maybe this was progress. But the pattern didn't feel random. He never chose the cheerful patients who still laughed with visitors. He never lingered with the ones who walked the halls slowly but surely each day. Instead, he always sought out the quiet rooms, the still ones, the patients who had grown weak, pale, or withdrawn. At first, staff told themselves it was coincidence, but unease began to creep in. Why those rooms? Why those patients? And why did Oscar, who wanted nothing to do with anyone, suddenly act like he belonged there? The whispers started in break rooms and hallways. Nurses traded nervous glances when they saw the cat pawing at a certain door. They began to hold their breath whenever he curled up tightly against a resident's side, because soon it became impossible to ignore. Whenever Oscar chose a patient, the end seemed to follow. The first time it happened, no one paid much attention. Oscar had slipped into the room of a frail old man who'd grown too weak to lift his head from the pillow. The cat, usually so aloof, leapt gently onto the bed and curled himself tightly against the man's side. Nurses exchanged puzzled looks, whispering about how strange it was to see Oscar willingly seek out human contact. Hours later, the man passed away peacefully, Oscar still pressed against him. Some said it was coincidence. "Cats know where it's warm," a nurse muttered, trying to brush off the unease. But others, watching Oscar leap down from the bed only after the final breath was taken, felt a shiver. Days passed before it happened again. One morning, nurses found Oscar pacing outside a locked patient's door. His tail lashed back and forth as he meowed insistently, scratching softly at the wood. "What's gotten into him?" one whispered, finally giving in and opening the door. Inside, the patient lay pale and fading, her breathing shallow. Hours later, she too was gone. This time, no one could ignore it. The whispers began. "The cat knows." By the third time, even skeptics struggled to stay calm. Oscar wandered into the room of a woman whose family sat anxiously by her side. He leapt onto the bed, but the daughter jumped up in alarm. "Get that cat out of here! He's upsetting her!" she cried. Nurses hesitated, but the family insisted. Oscar was carried out, hissing and twisting in protest. For hours he prowled the hallway outside, scratching at the door, his cries low and insistent. When at last the door opened again, it was not to let him in, but to allow doctors to pronounce the woman dead. The family froze. The nurses exchanged pale looks. Even the most logical among them could no longer dismiss what was happening. Something about Oscar was different. Soon, staff began keeping track. A few nurses started jotting notes in small notebooks, what rooms Oscar entered, how long he stayed, what happened afterward. And the pattern became undeniable. Oscar never chose randomly. He never curled up on the laps of cheerful patients who joked with visitors. He never pawed at the doors of those who still walked the hallways each day. His visits were reserved only for the frail, the fading, the ones who seemed to be standing on the very edge of life itself. And when he chose, death followed. Word spread quietly at first, only among staff. But families began to notice. They saw the way nurses stiffened when Oscar entered a room, how they cast each other knowing looks, how their voices dropped to whispers. Soon the rumors reached the families in the waiting rooms. Some said Oscar was an omen of death, a shadow that brought fear wherever he appeared. Others insisted he was a guardian angel, offering comfort in the final hours so no one had to pass alone. Either way, everyone agreed on one thing. Oscar was not just any cat. He was something more. But what exactly was he sensing? Was there some unseen signal, a smell, a sound that only he could detect? Or was it something beyond science, a sixth sense wrapped in fur and whiskers? No one could answer. And the more Oscar's pattern repeated, the more urgent the question became. Why was this cat so accurate? And what secret did he carry that even the doctors could not explain? It wasn't long before Steerhouse became divided. The nurses, who had seen Oscar's strange accuracy too many times to dismiss it, began treating his visits as warnings. When they spotted the cat curled beside a patient, they made quiet phone calls to families. "You might want to come soon," they'd say gently, never quite explaining why. But the families noticed, and not all of them were grateful. One night, a daughter stormed down the hallway, tears streaming down her face as she spotted Oscar perched on her mother's bed. "Get him out!" she screamed, clutching at the nurse's arm. "He's scaring her." "Don't you see? My mother doesn't need some cat telling her she's dying." The nurse hesitated, torn. "Please, you don't understand. He stays for a reason. You'll want this time with her." "I don't care about your superstition," the daughter snapped. "Keep him away from my mother." Oscar was carried out, his body stiff, eyes flashing green. In the hallway he hissed, pacing, refusing to leave the door. Hours later, the woman passed away. The daughter, broken and furious, whispered through her sobs, "You all knew, didn't you?" That was the heart of the divide. Was Oscar a cruel omen or a merciful guide? The doctors leaned toward the former. Leading them was Dr. David Dosa, a physician from Brown University. Stern, rational, devoted to science, he shook his head at the growing whispers. "Coincidence," he said firmly in staff meetings. "Nothing more. Cats curl up for warmth, for comfort. You're seeing patterns where none exist." But the nurses disagreed. They'd seen too much. Tensions boiled over one afternoon when Oscar slipped into the room of an elderly man. His family sat nearby, holding his frail hands, trying to keep him awake. The moment they noticed Oscar climbing onto the bed, panic erupted. "Get him out!" one son shouted, standing so quickly his chair toppled. "He's bad luck." But a nurse stood her ground. "No, he's not bad luck. He's giving you a chance." "A chance for what?" the son demanded. "To say goodbye," she whispered. The family stared at her, horrified. Seconds later, the argument turned into sobbing as the old man slipped into stillness, Oscar purring softly against his chest. Dr. Dosa, watching from the doorway, clenched his jaw. He could feel the weight of the family's eyes, fear, anger, grief. If he couldn't explain this, superstition would take root, and science would lose ground in his own ward. So he made a decision. If Oscar's so-called gift was real, he would prove it. And if it wasn't, he would expose it as coincidence once and for all. From that day forward, he began shadowing the cat. Clipboard in hand, he tracked every movement, every visit, every outcome. He marked down times, symptoms, patient conditions. His colleagues teased him, but he was determined this mystery would end. Then came the night that shook even him. Oscar padded into the room of a woman whose breaths rattled faintly in her chest. Her family sat dozing in chairs, unaware of how close the end was. The cat leapt gracefully onto the bed, curling against her arm. Dr. Dosa followed, frustration simmering. "Enough," he muttered, striding into the room. "This is ridiculous. Cats can't predict death. I'll prove it right now." He pulled out his pen, ready to jot another note, but when he looked up, his breath caught. The woman's breathing hitched, slowed, and within moments, stopped altogether. The room fell silent, save for the soft, steady purr vibrating from Oscar's chest. The doctor's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. His face drained of color as he stared at the cat. For the first time, science failed him, and the question he had dismissed so easily now clawed its way into his mind. What was Oscar sensing that none of them could see? The room was still when it happened again. A woman lay motionless beneath thin sheets, her breaths faint and uneven. Her family clutched her hands, whispering prayers, tears streaming down their faces. The clock ticked steadily, marking each fragile second. Then, as though summoned by some invisible signal, Oscar slipped quietly through the door. He leapt onto the bed, nestled against her arm, and began to purr. The sound was soft but steady, almost like a lullaby. Dr. Dosa stood at the foot of the bed, his clipboard in hand. He had come prepared this time, determined to prove that all of this was nothing more than coincidence. His pen hovered above the page, ready to record. But then, before he could write a single word, the woman's breathing changed. It slowed, grew shallow, and then stopped. The room fell silent. The family gasped. Nurses bowed their heads, and Oscar, unbothered, remained curled in place until the very end, purring gently as though escorting her somewhere beyond their sight. The doctor's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. His face drained of color. He could no longer deny it. This was not chance. This was not random. Oscar had predicted yet another death, perfectly. By the time Dosa completed his study, the numbers were undeniable. Oscar had correctly signaled more than 20 consecutive deaths. Statistically, the odds of that happening by accident were virtually zero. His findings were published in a respected medical journal. In it, he proposed one possible explanation. Perhaps as life draws to a close, the human body releases some chemical or scent so subtle that only an animal with a heightened sense of smell could detect it. Oscar, with the instincts of a predator and the sensitivity of a cat, might simply be responding to biology. But even as he wrote those words, Dosa felt a gnawing uncertainty. Because facts and numbers alone couldn't explain the way Oscar behaved. He didn't merely notice, he chose. He insisted on being there, fought to enter rooms, resisted being removed. His presence felt deliberate. Families who had once feared him began to see him differently. Some called him an omen, but most began to call him something else. A guardian. A gentle guide, ensuring that no one, no matter how forgotten, left this world alone. Even the skeptics, men and women who lived by science and reason, admitted quietly in the hallways that Oscar was different. There was something otherworldly about the way he curled up against the dying, something no data could ever truly capture. Dr. Dosa himself, once so determined to prove everyone wrong, now found himself staring at the cat with a mix of awe and unease. He had spent years studying dementia, mapping the decline of the human brain. But here was a creature who seemed to see what no doctor ever could. And that left him with a question he could not shake, one that lingered long after each patient had gone. Was Oscar merely sensing death, or was he guiding people into it? After Dr. Dosa's findings were published, there was no denying it anymore. Oscar's presence wasn't just tolerated, it became part of the rhythm of Steerhouse itself. When nurses spotted him padding into a room, they quietly reached for the phone. Families were called, sometimes in the middle of the night. "You should come now," they would say gently. Many who might have missed those final moments were able to gather, to hold hands, to whisper words of love, one last time. All because of Oscar. The scenes repeated over and over. A son clutching his mother's hand, glancing at the little cat curled on her chest, whispering, "Thank you. Thank you for letting me be here." A daughter in tears, watching Oscar purr softly until her father's last breath, realizing he had not been alone for even a second. Nurses, once skeptical, began leaving doors open whenever Oscar meowed insistently outside. They no longer tried to stop him. Deep down, they knew he had a job to do. Years turned into decades. Patient after patient, family after family, Oscar remained the quiet sentinel of the hospice, a creature who slipped into lives only at their ending, but left an impact that would never be forgotten. Locals gave him a name both feared and revered, the Angel of Death. By the time he reached old age, Oscar had been present for hundreds of final moments. And then, in 2022, his own time came. There was no family waiting for him, at least not the kind of family most patients had. Instead, the nurses and doctors who had once doubted him, who had argued over his presence, gathered at his side. They stroked his fur gently, whispered their thanks, and surrounded him with the same love he had given so many others in their final hours. Oscar slipped away peacefully, without warning, without fanfare. The Angel of Death had finally answered his own call. And yet his legacy lingered. In life, Oscar had avoided people. He hissed, he hid, he ran from affection. But in death, he had brought families together, given strangers one last chance to say goodbye, and taught even hardened skeptics that there are mysteries science may never fully explain. He showed the world that sometimes the smallest creature can give the greatest gift, the gift of making sure no one has to leave this world alone. Would you have trusted Oscar's strange gift, or dismissed him as just a cat?